society, just like physics, needs some sort of dark matter. It needs extra mass, not to be so susceptible to external influences, in particular propaganda and things like that. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk about time, in particular how time is perceived by the public, by the media for that matter, etc., etc. Like, I wanted to call it something like proximity, blah 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 something, but I don't actually know how I'm gonna call it in the end. But it's about proximity in terms of time and why does it matter. And I actually want to apologize in advance because this video is going to be a little bit chaotic. It's more of a collection of thoughts that I have on the topic rather than a single thought or single idea, as it sometimes is on this channel, like with certain supportive ideas, right? So, but hopefully you'll find something interesting here to think about yourself. So, on the topic, one thing I want to talk about, or at least mention, is the so-called Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, which is basically a variation of a frequency bias, alright? So I'm gonna link all the relevant links in the description so you can read about it more if you wish. So what is Baader-Meinhof phenomenon? Well, it is a phenomenon when a person, let's say, reads or sees or listens to something or about something, and then it kind of is in their RAM, so to speak, right? And they start noticing it more and more around them, right? Or at least like they receive a name for something they haven't known previously, that it has a name, it is collected into a single entity as an object, so to speak, and they start noticing this object everywhere almost, right? So this is the phenomenon. You can read about the history of it. It's actually like Baader and Meinhof were the leaders of the socialistic terrorist group in Germany in 1970s, kind of like modern Antifa, but more serious, let's say. And they well, it just turns out that the person who kind of discovered this effect, even though not quite, who had this occur to them, actually read about Baader and Meinhof and then like noticed these names somewhere else. So it's not like a psychologists or anything, it's just random people from this terrorist group who this phenomenon is named after, right? I actually have my own Baader-Meinhof moment, exactly with Baader and Meinhof involved, believe it or not. So, like around 10 years ago, when I was let's say socializing with some local socialists, no pun intended, like before I turned into like a radical libertarian, I was more into socialistic groups. So, on one of the meetings, like I've read about Baader-Meinhof phenomenon like a few days before that, and we've had then a meeting with this group that I've been into, and I've noticed that like one of these, you know, typical local socialistic newspapers, like it was just lying on the table, and I've noticed there was an article about Baader and Meinhof, and I'm like, oh damn, what an irony, you know. It's actually pretty cool. Anyway, so that's one thing concerning like proximity in terms of time and like how public and just like individual people perceive information or respond to information. It's like you have this pattern imprinted into you by your previous experience. Like, let's say you read about something, and then like it hasn't completely washed out of your like close memory, so to speak, operative memory, right? So you can easily find it here and there, right? So it creates this sort of bias when you think it's much more frequent than it is, and it's sort of this almost mystical experience, you know, when, oh, it's the universe giving me signs, you know, like this thing is actually maybe important, you know, or something like that. So yeah. Or maybe it is actually the case. Maybe universe actually gives you the signs. I don't know. It's up to you to decide. So that's one kind of famous, sort of famous phenomenon that can influence public's perception of things, right? If something is sort of a trending meme, so to speak, like it actually like exponentially grows, if you wish. Like people start noticing it everywhere, people start caring about it perhaps way too much, right? So all the mass hysteria arises and things like that. Like, you know the examples, we don't have to go very far to find them. Literally in the last couple of years there have been at least 2 of them, right? Maybe even more. So, of course, these memes can be localized, they can be more or less global, again, you know what I mean. But anyway, in general though, that was the case when we are like close to the thing, right? It's in our operative memory, but in general, if you like bring a piece of news to the people, they would quickly forget about it, actually, like maybe in a couple of days. If it's like some very, very disturbing and like kind of shifting the way of life kind of news, like a new law that does something that, you know, disrupts your way of life in some way, then okay, it's very unpleasant. You would kind of keep thinking about it for months maybe, but like in a couple of years you would forget anyway. You would like adapt to the new way of life, right? So that's how it works. So, you know, this proverbial goldfish memory. So the public has more or less goldfish memory. It can barely remember what has been happening like a day ago, you know, let alone like a month ago or even a year ago or 10 years ago. Like nobody remembers what happened 10 years ago, right? Actually, again, goldfishes, actual goldfishes have much better memory, like at least a week, I would say. I mean, that depends on what kind of memory we're talking about, but it has been demonstrated that their memory is actually pretty good, when it matters, at least. All right? So the public is actually worse than a goldfish in this respect. All right, I don't want to digress too much, but like again, I wish to kind of reiterate this metaphor of Coltrane, who said that, you know, a human family behaves like a troop of gorillas, and like the so like the intelligence like degenerates as we move far, like to bigger and bigger masses of people, right? So like the big collective of people behaves like a herd, like of cattle or something, and like a city behaves like an ant farm or something like that, and like the whole humanity behaves almost like a gas. But that's already my addition to Coltrane. He didn't talk about this. I talk about this in Onion of Aliens video. But anyway, let's move on. So one other thing I wanted to notice is how interesting it is, and I've already made this comment in other video, how interesting it is to actually look for news in previous periods, you know, the news about the well, whatever, or like predictions of the current events. It's always very interesting, like what people said like 2 years ago about what can happen now, right? Like people don't do that because people are concerned with right now, you know, live in the moment and stuff. But it's actually a very interesting cultural archaeology, so to speak, to just go and look for it, right? Because again, all of these things often contradict what is happening now, and like the contrast actually helps you sort of grasp better, like who is who, at least in the public domain. Like, all right, I don't want to digress to this too much, but whatever. One interesting offshoot of that is looking into your own history of, you know, your own social media behavior, and perhaps your emails or something like that, something that can be easily accessed right now. So you look at your posts from like 5 years ago, And of course, it's very cringy, you know. It's, like you would probably be very embarrassed, right? Or 10 years ago, you would be even more embarrassed. Like it would be like face palm level of embarrassment, most likely. You know, your Twitter history, proverbial, right? Which is interesting because, again, people change, right? So that's why you are so embarrassed by that. So how could I be this person, you know? Is this person really me? I mean, of course, we can derive some, again, philosophical / biological thingies here and say, well, actually, this person was kind of another person. Like, most of the body cells are new in your actual body right now than were these other cells. But anyway, yeah, so people change, obviously, but what is interesting about this is that our morality actually kind of prohibits that. Like, it says, no, you shouldn't change, you should act constant, you know. It's understandable why, because again, you cannot really build a society if, let's say, a person doesn't do what they say. Like, I say, okay, I'll bring you, give me these potatoes, I'll bring you money tomorrow, right? I take your potatoes, but I don't bring any money tomorrow. It's obviously very bad behavior, right? So we should introduce some sort of morality to prevent that, so that people would keep their promises, keep their words, be sort of stable, reliable, you know, almost like objects, like solid, you know, never changing. So it's an interesting contradiction where we know that people change, we know that people make promises and give their word, and etc., while under the effect of some sort of passion or emotion or whatever state, right? And yet we have this requirement of them to stay constant, almost inhuman requirement, if you know what I mean. And some people are proud of being inhuman in this way, almost like they're robots or machines, right? I am super constant, I am super reliable, you know, я твой слуга, я твой работник, you know, like a Kraftwerk. I'm your servant, I'm your worker, man machine, if you didn't get the reference. Okay, so, right, so some more assortment of thoughts. I've already mentioned in another video this wave character of propaganda, which is again connected to this short memory span of the public, right? So it's not enough to introduce a Chinese flu, right? It's like, it would diminish over time. People would forget, people would adapt, people would say, I'm kind of tired of this crap. So you need to introduce new variants, right? So that to keep the hype going, you know. Right? So just like any franchise, really. So this engineered flu is a franchise ultimately, right? So we have a Marvel universe, and it's not enough to have an Iron Man. We need to keep the hype going with the first Avenger and the Thor and the Hulk and whatever else, right? So, you know, and then maybe something else, then maybe we combine it, then maybe we make a spin-off and prequel and something else, right? So we need to keep the hype going, or like, actually watch my video End of the End, where I talk about how like finished narratives are being surpassed by franchises ultimately, or fictional universes, right? As the hierarchies again are being substituted with or for networks, all right? Again, see the link in the description. Or speaking about franchises, I'll also link a video about McRib in the description, which is again, McDonald's need to introduce McRib again, right? Anyway, so returning to Baader-Meinhof, so yeah, low attention span of the public, and not only of the public, but a person as well. I mean, you can only keep so much stuff in your attention, right? Only a few things really. And as you go, there is some sort of law of similarity. I wouldn't go into too much of a philosophical depths about what is the law of similarity. I've already talked about this sometime before, but anyway, speaking of like this Baader-Meinhof, so there's a pretty easy analogy to sort of intuitively grasp what I'm talking about. So imagine you are like a resonating fork, right? Or at least a part of you, right? You have some segment, perhaps represented, if you're like super physicalist, represented by some neural network, like literally a network of neurons, like a certain configuration of certain neurons in your brain, for example. So it works like a tuning fork. Like if it acquired this piece of information, some sort of recognizable pattern, like let's say Baader-Meinhof, it's sort of tuned to it right now, all right? And whenever you encounter this Baader-Meinhof again in the external world, it would resonate, right? Like this fork would start ringing. Okay, I recognize that. This is the thing. We should, notice that. We should take notice. So yeah, so you will start finding patterns that you're searching for ultimately. But with time, again, this proximity diminishes. If this fork wasn't used all that often, it would kind of dissipate, these neurons would find some other job, some other work to do. And this alliance of theirs would dissipate, they would become parts of some other network, and ultimately your memory would be erased in some way, right? In some form. And also, as a person grows older, I think something similar happens. Like you accumulate these forks in your memory. Like first time you encounter something, like you're reading an encyclopedia or something, you encounter a term, then you sort of try to apply it wherever, right? Maybe you've had this experience. Like I've actually done this. Like I remember that my favorite pastime was actually reading encyclopedia just randomly. Like you just open a random page and start reading, and then it links to some other article. You find this article, you read about that as well. It's also a form of a hypertext, right? It's sort of an HTML kind of thing in encyclopedias. But anyway, what I was talking about is after that, like when you first encounter, okay, it's full of excitement, you kind of establish some sort of new connection to the external world, right? But as you grow older and as more and more of these things accumulate, you are not as excited anymore. Like there's not very little new things, and even those new things that you see, they don't excite you as much anymore because, well, you're kind of full already, you're like a mental palace is already filled, right, with this other crap that you've accumulated throughout your life. So yeah, these forks are not as loud anymore, right? So you kind of don't care about anything at some point already, or care about very little thing. I mean, little in terms of quantity, not in terms of quality. So yeah. And another thing I wanted to mention with regards to that, not that in particular, but the topic we're talking about is, again, this analogy of slowly boiling frog. If you put the frog in like a cold water and start, well, supposedly, I don't know if it's actually have been done or tested, I don't know. But supposedly, if you put a frog in like a cold water and start slowly heating it up to the boiling point, the frog would never notice that it's actually boiling and it would die, right? But if you put the frog in the boiling water in the first place, it would like obviously be burned and would try to jump out, right? So, I'm bringing this analogy in terms of, demonstrating how, again, returning to that example that I've given you before, how like even if a law is passed that is very disruptive to you, you would slowly adapt to it, right? So you would be maybe outraged in the first like weeks or even months, but in a couple of years you would just adapt. You would say, okay, it's the new thing, right? And the new generation that comes after you it has never knew any other way of doing things, if you know what I mean, in society. It would think that it's normal, right, already, because, well, it's already a thing of the past for them. So since the society haven't crumbled from the moment this law has passed to the moment they were born, then, well, maybe it's not as bad, right? Like, it seems to be working decently, right? So it's kind of a very dangerous dynamic in the society, right? Where we're slowly drifting to this point of boiling, right? So the elites oppress people more and more, etc., etc. So, yeah. Basically, it's a mechanism, and again, like this short attention span of the people only reinforces this dynamic, right? So it makes it almost impossible to beat. Like, you would say, well, repeal this stupid law from 50 years ago, and people would say, why? I mean, everything seems to be cool, right? We're living for like half a century with it already. Okay. So, yeah. So it allows a quick enslavement of people, actually. And again, recent events have shown how quick a population can be enslaved, right? And ultimately, in this respect, I would say that the socio-cultural codes, even though it's kind of a stupid expression, but they can be rewritten in more or less one generation, right? Again, seeing how rapidly people adapt to new, basically catastrophic conditions. Well, firstly, it demonstrates how resilient human species is, right? Or are, I don't know if it's plural. Humans are, let's say. They can adapt to pretty much anything, but that's also the problem. Like, if the elites would like to impose some sort of like completely draconic measures, people would still adapt and would be kind of fine, I mean, look at North Korea. People adapted, right? They're living more or less fine, at least by their own standards. So, yeah. Like, again, this goalpost, I guess, I don't know, of standards, it's very flexible. It can move up and down, like orders of magnitude, basically. All right. And obviously, there's no accountability for the authorities, right? Again, this proverbial goalpost can be moved anywhere, right? Apologies. So, 2 weeks of hard lockdown in March of 2020 that haven't yet finished by May of 2022. I mean, maybe these are Venusian weeks. Actually, even Venusian weeks would... No, actually, yeah, these could have been Venusian weeks, and then it would be fine. They should have at least, be more specific about this little detail, I guess. And then again, people saying, the flu is gonna kill everyone, but now Mr. Gates tells us that, we actually severely overestimated the danger, right? Maybe we shouldn't have done this. But again, the experimental genetic alteration have already been done on billions of people. So now we can wrap this up, right? Now we can slowly like retract our previous statements. Again, returning to the morality issue, right? Like, again, like we say one thing today and completely opposite thing 2 years later, and it's fine, right? The goldfish doesn't care. Like, no accountability anyway. Okay. One analogy I had when I was thinking about those things is like frames of reference, in like a relativity, like they're local, right? So yeah, like we can't trivially return back like several years and like remember how exactly it was back then. It was a completely different world, right? So frames of reference. I'll probably have to cut this out, at least the sound, but I'll probably forget, so apologies. So the frames of reference are local, not only in terms of space, but also in terms of time, right? That's what I'm talking about. Time is like a distance in itself, and here's why I'm talking about it as a proximity in terms of time. Like, as Russian philosopher Galkovsky said, that the strongest force in the universe is the distance, and I would generalize it to time, right? Not only physical distance, but also temporal distance. And it's not that big of a deal to make such a generalization, right? It's fairly obvious. All right. That's probably enough for today, but I'll mention a couple of things as well, because I have them, and probably no other video would fit them anyway. So, one thing I was thinking about at some point is how people actually slowly drift through their lives, right? Not really doing anything in terms of like anything proactive, if you wish. Like, they're just stuck in this, I don't know, on a train or something that goes somewhere where they don't know where. Like, they're not in control of their life. And again, this sounds kind of moralistic, and I don't really want it to, but it's just, like, in particular, I'm talking about myself. This is, I'm actually thinking about my own life mostly, like, how it kind of goes somewhere and you don't know where, and you can't really control it. Like, almost things happen to you and you have no say in it, no initiative. Even though you're doing stuff, you're still not having an initiative. You're almost like a robot, you know, something like that. And I've wanted to call it like making a non-choice, non-choice, meaning that you're not making any choices really, right? You're making a choice of not choosing anything, right? You're making a choice of like keeping the status quo, basically, slowly drifting. And again, with society, I believe it can be the same. Like, very rarely we see some sort of radical transformations, right? It just seems that things progress in some pretty gradual manner, and nobody really knows to where. Like, where are we going, right? So we are, as a society, I think, kind of making a non-choice at the moment. And it's kind of sad at the very least, right? It's kind of, not disturbing. What's the other word? Like, well, sad is the best one I can give you right now. Depressing, probably. Yeah, that's the better term. All right. So how can we possibly counteract all of this? Like, we're slowly going to the end of this video. Well, obviously, enhance the memory, right? So if the problem is that public has no memory, maybe we need somebody who would be keeping this memory, right? And in this respect, like, I think that such occupations as, let's say, investigative journalism is really, really good right now, because again, with our hyper-information today, even in open sources, you can find so much stuff, so much interesting stuff about many, many people, right? So you can go past like a decade or even 2 in some cases, or even 3, and uncover some more interesting stuff, probably even more interesting than today, right? So you can make very interesting conclusions with regards to that. So I almost envision, it's not really a prediction, but I can see that happening, that in some very near future, like let's say a couple of years from now, or even less than that, or maybe even more than that, like maybe 5 years, there would be some society would appear, or a collective, or a project, like a global one, which would actually, like, the task of which would be to try to, like, accumulate some sort of narratives connected to certain people, let's say, or certain organizations, or certain, I don't know, technologies, or things like that, right? So I almost think about it as, you know, the Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout universe. Well, the task of which is to preserve the technology. Well, in this case, it would be to preserve the information. So, yeah. So if a person appears today and says, okay, you all need to get vaccinated, you can, like, look into the archives of this organization and see, okay, this person is actually like a devout socialist and like a fan of, well, you know, centralized planning, and he wants to basically build a concentration camp of the size of the planet. So maybe you shouldn't then. That's just an idea. All right, so we need to enhance memory, right? That's basically the most obvious answer to the lack of memory and all the detrimental effects that I've mentioned previously that are associated with the lack of memory. So, but hyperinformation itself actually prevents memory from working properly, right? We're constantly bombarded with new and new and new and new and even more new stuff, right? We're in this ADHD state constantly. So longer narratives crumble under this pressure, let's say. So again, longer narratives correspond to hierarchies, right? And now we have networks instead of hierarchies. So longer narratives not only crumble in terms of different possible interpretations. So in one interpretation, you can have this narrative. In another one, it's actually completely different. But they also crumble just in terms of, like, mechanistically, like you just cannot hold them in your, well, imagination, in your sensorium, so to speak. In your operative memory, if you wish. All right. And not only narratives about something, but even your own narrative about yourself would crumble. And so it also, again, relates to that making a non-choice thing, where people can no longer build their own narrative of their own lives, right? Previously it was pretty much set up, like, you go serving in the army, you become like a career military guy, or you go study music, you become a musician. And like, all of these hierarchies have really well established, you know, ways of promotion and, like, goalposts, like checkpoints that you should reach. Okay, even in science, like, okay, I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, I have a PhD, now I have like a position at the university or whatever. So these are all, you know, checkpoints which kind of define your path, if you wish. But right now we kind of don't have that. We kind of have remnants of that, right? But it's already obvious that people kind of try to evade that. They try to build something exclusive just for themselves, but they don't know how most of the time, right? So they kind of, again, turn into this proverbial guy in the basement who's just like drifting through life with no goal and no motivation and no anything really, right? Not only guys obviously suffer from this, like women as well, like with all the feminist propaganda and all the BS. But okay, I don't really want to linger on this topic too much. But to be short, like women are being told, like, again, live in the moment, blah de blah, like you are super beautiful, super empowered. But then when they turn 30, it turns out that actually, like, high quality men don't want these women anymore. When they're 40, it's like a completely game over, basically. And like Again, 35-year-old women are surprised, like, where are all the good men? Well, obvious, they're chasing like 20-year-olds, right? Just like they were chasing you 15 years ago. So yeah. So, yeah, so it's a big problem, I think, like, because it basically concerns everyone, like every person on this planet, like how to actually make your life make any sense, if you wish, how to build a good story arc for your character, you know. Again, see my video Meaning of Life, where I kind of talk about the meaning of life in a bit more detail. All right. Yeah, so memory can help us. Hyperinformation helps us in a way, but actually it prevents us from having memory, from keeping people accountable, from being susceptible, is that a word? Susceptible, I think, right? To all the propaganda and the media narratives. By the way, watch my video, How Skepticism Makes You Easier to Control, about the media narratives. Also, obviously, atomization of society and urbanization helps a lot. But that's just one of the prerequisites of the network-oriented society, right? Atomization and urbanization. An abolishment of tradition helps a lot. Like, again, as I've said, you no longer have these established hierarchies through which you can rise, right? But by their own rules, like whatever they are. Yeah. And in general, like liberalization. Like, I would actually, again, draw another analogy from physics. I would say that the society or the public lacks mass, if you wish. It lacks inertia. So it's very susceptible. Like a small gust of wind can like completely turn it sideways, right? So it's very light, like a feather. It can be like, you know, thrown back and forth by anything, by any even not very cleverly crafted piece of propaganda, right? So yeah, and just like in physics, even though it's not in parentheses, we need dark matter here in some sense. Maybe I'll actually call this video. So maybe it's actually the point of this video, even though I haven't had any points when I started recording it to actually make. Maybe this is actually the main point of this video, that society, just like physics, needs some sort of dark matter. It needs extra mass, not to be so susceptible to external influences, in particular propaganda and things like that. Like memory, it's also a mass in some sense, right? A mass remembers its state of motion, right? That's what mass is. It's a memory about the state of motion, essentially. That's also a great definition, which I came up literally right now with. That's pretty interesting. So, like, a huge lead cube, like, it remembers that it's stationary, so you have to really push it hard, push it really hard to make it move, right? To change its state of motion. It says, you know, I remember, this is my state. You need to convince me really hard to move. So this is how a society should behave, I think. But obviously that's a bit of a stretch at the moment. All right. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.